I'm going to give you a quick overview about migrant journey, the nature of the challenge and cross-cultural communications framework that I will introduce. And I'll briefly talking about the 1.5 second generations. So what do migrants bring in their luggage besides clothes? What do you think they might bring in when they come to New Zealand? Any thoughts?
Their different beliefs and value system.
Absolutely. So what they accustomed to and what they bring and what they believe as appropriate, isn't it? And how the social norms works in the society. Any other thoughts?
Language,
Yeah,
different languages.
absolutely. Language is a big one, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah. So beside that, they might also bring hope and aspirations. They might also bring in loss and grief as well, because moving into a new country where they might not, like having the close knit of families. Fears is one of them. Migrations is never just a geographical movement. And people do not only move countries, they carry a kind of invincible luggage as well. Some traditional responsibility and expectation is another one. Faith and spirituality, stories and experience, education skills, and so on. So what are some of the challenges of the new migrants might experience?
The
Just
basic challenge.
navigating a foreign system, like, figuring out who does what and where to do it.
Yeah, that is a big part of it, isn't it? Navigating a very different system. Yes, awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing what Ian said. It's just kind of getting accustomed to a new culture, different weather, different styles of living, different foods, just navigating simple things of setting up a bank or getting an ID document. So kind of that day-to-day stuff.
Isn't that interesting? Like I hear so many people telling me that as an international student, they're not able to have a bank account because they didn't have an address. They might still looking for a permanent space to live. You don't just move to a new country. You also need to relearn and understand how to navigate the system. What has been very instrumental to me is when I come across this theory, which is ecological social systems put together by these two scientists who study tree and forests. And so I'm going to share with you why it made sense to me when I saw the brief documentary.
Trees may look like solitary individuals, but the ground beneath our feet tells a different story. Trees are secretly talking, trading, and waging war on one another. They do this using a network of fungi that grow around and inside their roots. The fungi provide the trees with nutrients, and in return they receive sugars. But scientists have found this connection runs far deeper than first thought. By plugging into the fungal network, trees can share resources with each other. The system has been nicknamed the Wood Wide Web. It's thought that older trees, fondly known as mother trees, use this fungal network to supply shaded seedlings with sugars, giving them a better chance of survival. Those trees that are sick or dying may dump their resources into the network, which might by healthier neighbours. Plants also use fungi to send messages to one another. If they're attacked, they can release chemical signals through their roots, which can warn their neighbours to raise their defences. But like our internet, the Wood Wide Web has its dark side too. Some orchids hack the system to steal resources from nearby trees. And other species, like the black walnut, spread toxic chemicals through the network to sabotage their rivals. Arboreal cybercrime aside, scientists are still debating why plants seem to behave in such an altruistic way. The hidden network creates a thriving community between individuals. When you're next in woodland, you might like to think of trees as part of a big superorganism, chatting and swapping information and food under your feet.
Have you seen the document, this BBC, how trees talk to each other? You'll never look at a tree same again, isn't it, after watching it? But what I find very intriguing is that the tree actually functions similar to human society. Let's say we all are a tree, we make out of a forest, and each of us are deeply connected to our network. And in each of those networks, we swap information and exchange information in way that are invincible. However, that is how we enrich our own tree and also how to connect with the society at large. Using that metaphors to think about how me as an adult tree being outrooted and moved to New Zealand, and so then being planted into a new environment, my roof will cut off. What that means is all the nutrients, all the social connections, all that will gone. The challenge with a big tree is that when you are deeply connected to the root, you have that solid soil to support you, but when you're being as a transplanted new tree, it's not connected. So despite I have my inherent nutrients still with me, but external circumstances like winds or rain will actually make me fall to the ground because I do not have that support system. And so despite I can be in a society at large, but it doesn't mean that I am connecting to the network. So give you an example, what they didn't mention is that the mother tree will only give their own nutrient to seedling that they created. So any new tree which is planted, they will not touch it. That is a self-defense mechanism because they do not know what kind of diseases they might have. And similarly, it will take years for the new planted tree to reach out and able to find their social network. So that again, similar to our human existence, isn't it? So coming to a new country as a new tree means that individual might become slightly vulnerable because of lack of social connection. It doesn't mean that they do not have the nutrient themselves, but it would deplete it if they do not connect to the wider network. And so using that metaphor help us to conceptualize why migration can be a challenge for some of the individual. And ironically, for a new grow tree and nursery who just started, it'll be easier for them to be growing in their social network because they are more agile and also they do not have that kind of big trunk that might become vulnerable because of lack of social network. And they can easily move into the environment and really develop something that, probably as an adult might take years to be becoming. So if you really think about migration mirror these disruptions, of course, loss of language, social isolation, identity, and system navigation, which we have mentioned. But I also want to bring in another element, which is based on Abraham's Maslow hierarchy. If you really look at migrants in terms of the 5 level, basically most of them, when they come to the new country, they'll only look for physiological need and safety needs. And love and belonging, that will certainly take much longer time to develop. And if they have that, their own families and then move into New Zealand together, they will still have that, but that wider connections might be slightly difficult. And with that understanding, especially with the mother tree, the first generation like myself who just came to New Zealand, I will need to re-establish all that network. And for people who have been here longer, of course, the social network will be much larger and bigger. But for the first and second, it will be a lot more smaller in some way. It doesn't mean that it won't change, but it's just going to take time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you guys to have a picture in your head what type of dragon you first thought about. So there's 2 type of dragons that I'm going to show you. One is the Eastern Dragon, number A, and the B is Game of Thrones dragon. So which one of you have number A dragon that pop out in your head? Yeah. Which one of you have the Game of Thrones dragon that pop out in your head, right? So they both call dragons, right? But their meaning is significantly different. Because the Chinese dragon or Eastern dragons are representing Chinese, and for us, we call the dragon of descendants. China in the old day, the dragons represent the emperor. And so dragons have a significant meaning of prosperity, respect, dignity. But the Western dragons mean a destroyer. What I'm trying to highlight here is we might use similar words. The meaning and interpretation behind it can be completely different. And quite often, we do not check the assumptions. Governments mean different things to different people. For us, we see it as trusted services. For some communities of different regions, they see as mistrust. They see as, like authoritative. And so all these little nuances can actually influence how we approach when it comes to interacting with people represent government agency as such. There's just one example. And then the other one is lunch. What the first lunch that pop out in your mind? So either is this, like yummy hot bowl of noodle or this sandwich most of Western society have as a cuisine. When I first came to New Zealand as an international student in 2001, Asian food wasn't that available. And even if it's available, they are very expensive. And to adapt to the environment, I learned how to eat sandwich in my age of 28, I have never eaten a cold chicken before. That was really my first time to have a cold chicken because in Malaysia, everything have to serve at hot food temperature. And cold for us is a big no-no. So beside that, I also decided I need to learn how to eat New Zealand food, potato, pasta, sandwich. The first year, I didn't have any rice and I was hungry all the time. Despite how much I eat, I still feel hungry until after a year, suddenly that just shifted. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't feel hungry anymore. So it looks like a very simple behavior change, but sometimes because how our body have accustomed to certain things, it might require a significant shift. But now I'm going to shift forward to cross-cultural thinking where this framework has been put together, not by me. They are mostly social psychologists. A little bit of background though. The reason why all this framework came about was when the IBM decided to move to China and shift their company overseas, they encountered a lot of challenges and the productivity wasn't really great. And also there is a lot of conflict. And hence then they hire a good Hofstadter who's German social psychology to look at the behavior and survey. And through him, he bring together the theory based on anthropologists' finding. And then that became something quite big for any businesses who want to go overseas and invest to understand cross-cultural communication. But unfortunately, information as such is not widely used in public sector. When I first came to New Zealand, when I have a problem and go and talk to my lecturer, I always ask, so what are you going to do? How are you going to make the decisions? For me, I felt a little bit weird because for our culture, we seek advice from authorities. We come to someone because we believe that they have the wisdom, they can guide us. And to suddenly being asked to make decisions on the spot was really challenging for me. Partly because of our culture have less emphasis on autonomy and self-determination. Asians across many continents emphasis in harmony. And so when we have issue challenges, the approach is to ask someone who have more experience than you. And then when I come across this individualistic collective culture, I start to realize that why I was asked to make decisions. But how would I describe it if I have to describe it to someone about collective culture? I would say collective culture is like an orchestra where you can see the picture, everybody have a role in there to play music by creating harmony tones that people can enjoy. And that is like Asian culture. We all have a role and responsibility to play, but ultimately the purpose is for a greater good, bigger than us. When you compare to the individualistic culture, I often say it's more like a soloist. They all going through the same process, learning music and so forth, but the differences is when it's time for them to step out, i.e. become an adult, they are asked to reinterpret the music the way that represent who they are. So they're more expressive, what they feel and believe. And the idea is to show who they are, to show how they're different from others. And so we have a very too polarized view about how individuals should function in the society. But it doesn't mean that in a collective culture, we do not have autonomy. It's just we've been taught when you walk into a place like an orchestra, you immediately surrender your power to the conductor. And hence we are taught to give our power away to someone else, let other people to make those decisions and guide us through. If you're working with communities where people, especially leaders, usually will speak on behalf of the groups, that is part of the reason, because they are taught not to speak, but allowing the leader to make those decisions on behalf of them. And because of that, I felt really discomfort when I use I when I first at university, because the I for me always represents my family, my moms, my dad. And I do a lot of training for mental health professionals, especially postgraduate paper for cross-cultural communication. I say that's why when it's come to health decisions, you suddenly ask people to make decision right there and right now, they feel a little bit uncomfortable because they might need to have a discussion with their family. I mean, there are people who in an individualistic culture would do that, but the differences is for individualistic culture, when they do that, it's more about seeking more advice and then reflect on themselves, what they ultimately the decisions they want to do. But for collective culture, it's more about what the majority thinks I should be doing. So that process is very different. And hence, we are less encouraged to develop that kind of intrapersonal relationships and more toward that interpersonal relationships. Examples like the talking therapies, suddenly you need to sit there and unpack everything about yourself. It looks quite easy for Westerner, the model, because people have that intrapersonal relationships. But when it comes to interpersonal relationships, I give you an example like my mom. Every time when I call her and ask her how she is, she'll talk to me about her auntie, her friends, other people. And for years, I was like, I just want to know how you're doing. And I was imposing my value to her until one day I realized that I need to stop doing it. Because for her, the indication of well-being is not her, it's the people surrounding her. And also how much she can contribute. And so by making a contrast, she actually telling me she's doing very well because she's helping all these people. And so that is the way that she's telling me she's doing good. She still have her health issue, but in general, she's happy. And as such, our culture, Asians are more hierarchical instead of egalitarians where power are equally distributed. And when I first saw kids outside in the supermarket and how Kiwi parents would just go down to their level and leveling with them and explain things to them, I was like, oh my God, back in my home country, that kids will be definitely get a hiding immediately. There wouldn't be any negotiations. But why that is because most of the kids here are treated as a human being with equal power. So parents want to help them to develop that kind of autonomy, self-determinations, and they are treated with the equal right as another person. For Asians, collective culture is extended members of the collective groups. So the idea is to mold them to understand how to behave in that group setting. So that kind of self-selections and determinations sometimes can perceive as selfish. So hence, like hierarchical structures, it have its own place to keep that harmony going. We really value relationships, so it's less task oriented. Because for task oriented, which is if you go and see a GP, you only have 15 minutes. They want to get all the questionnaire done, and then they tell you the result, and then you're out of your way with prescriptions or referral. But if you really go and look at traditional health approach from different culture, especially i.e. acupuncture, they're not just treating the individual. They talk to them about their family, about who they are, how long they've been here. And then when they go to visit their acupuncturist, they have all sort of conversations that happening. The idea is in a collective culture, we see people not in a vacuum, like just that individual. We see that person in the context of the society. So knowing individual beyond that person is critical in building the relationships. And with that, quite often when people enter to a space, they immediately will thinking about, oh, how can I build that relationships? That's why you can see they usually have a lot more small talk about family members and all that. So it's similar to Whanonga Tanga. Instead of immediately just say, okay, what do you want? Tell me, and then I give you what you want. Because in individualistic society, they value time as well. And so time is the more critical element. But in a collective culture, they value the relationship base you have with trust. So trust become a critical thing. But trust also different in different culture because beside qualifications, able to do the job, that is a given, but that itself will not be. I'm going to share with you the specific culture and diffuse culture, which what we have touched on. The things that I want you to remember is that in our collective culture, when we have a teacher who have taught us in the school through our primary school, and then to that person, when we meet them on the street, we call them teacher. They will be the teacher of life. Even when they retire or the school principal, they will still be regarded as the principal in their life. In New Zealand, if a teacher after work, they might see their parents. It depends on individual. The parents might want to approach the teacher. A specific culture is more compartmentalized. So each of the role and responsibility are segment and slides and dice in these compartments that, they only use in that function. And once that person walk out on that setting, they're back to who they are as individual. But a diffuse culture, we are kind of, intermingle with everything together. Example would be a colleagues might be friendly during work day, but not expect social context outside of work, which is quite common. unless you have this really close-knit nuclear family that might happen. And usually it's task-oriented, and diffuse culture manager might expect social connection as trust and underpin the collaboration. The colleagues might be your boss, you still have to attend the birthday. And then buy them gifts because, like, again, that trust and connections, and also that diffuse culture because, like, they are boss, you need to build that relationship. In New Zealand, you can just say, no, I'm not going to. They might not even invite you to the birthday party. Diffuse culture means privacy, confidentiality, and the boundary is a lot more blurred. So because people bring in their role and responsibility as a whole, instead of seeing that that person is person and the roles and responsibility is not with them all the time. You will see a community leaders who really work for the communities, especially at the ethnic space. They are being inundated with requests. And they also kind of have that, like head-on being two spaces. You're like, where's your work-life balance? But unfortunately, that's part of the culture. When you become a conductor, that conductor responsibilities carry on throughout the whole journey of that individual. It's called the low context and high context. And usually, when it comes to low context society, you refer to a Western society, and high context reference to mostly Asians and some part as well, like French. But how low context society being developed is through migrations, like Americans. When they first have vast migrants move into America where different languages were spoken. And so to do trade and business exchange, they have to straight to the point. And so then, like they can make things happen. That was the early day. And so it became this really straightforward, ask what you want, say what you want, and then the transactions can be done. A high context society usually refer to a monoculture society, especially places like Japan, where they have a long lineage of a same culture that's being transferred from one generation to another generation. So language is not necessarily become the vehicle on asking people of what and do want to do. It's through nonverbal cue that people can tell through eye contact or another setting where they know how to behave. I give you an example, which is this facilitator from America who was cross-cultural communication experts, went to Japan and did the workshops. After the workshops, she asked people, do you have any questions? And none of the Japanese would put their hands out and ask questions. So she thought, oh, yeah, job done. And then so she say thank you, and then she sit down. But the Japanese counterpart who facilitate the workshop and say, can you give me a moment? So she start doing the same thing, but no one raise hand or ask questions as say, I have something to ask you. But she can immediately point to people like, yeah, you have questions. Yeah, you have questions. And then they all able to raise questions to the Japanese facilitator. And so that made the facilitator who from America to curious about how then who is asking questions without raising their hand. And she say, in general, Japanese do make eye contact. That is not their cultures. But if they want to ask you questions, they will look at you, and then they want to ask you questions. So sometimes we assume behavior in terms of what we want people to do. They will know how to behave in a way that align with that culture, which is not necessary unless you not understand the non-verbal cue, especially in the Asian communities. And so two people walk into the same situations, the interpretations will be completely different. But another thing is that in terms of this low and high context also highlight how we actually communicate, the way that we talk to each other. For country like New Zealand, let's say when it come to address, you start with unit, street, suburb, city, and country. Very straightforward. But if you look at address from China, actually they start from country, city, suburbs, street name, and unit number in Mandarin. But in English, of course, like they reverse back to the low context. But what does that tell you is that in the Western world individualistic culture, when they do verbal communication, they will straight to the point. It's like a triangle. They tell you what they want, and then they elaborate why. For Asian culture, we'll start telling you why, how, what, then only go down to a point exactly what we want. So if you ever experience someone from a collective culture sharing you with information that you don't quite get what exactly they want, give them that time, because they will not be able to tell you straight away what they want. They will tell you left, right, and center, and that was confirmed by interpreter who say she struggled when she was being an interpreter and helping a doctor to communicate information to people from ethnic background. Because she say until she attended this, she then realized, wow, that is exactly what's going on. That's why sometimes the doctor get really frustrated. It's like, why they don't give me the answer, or the patient get frustrated as well. And simply because the way that communication is different. And so why is that? Because if you look at a collective culture where they value more relational, if I have a rubbish bin that's always, like my neighbor always put it out a little bit too much on their driveway, I will not go and knock on their door and say, hey, can you move your rubbish bin? It's always on my driveway, because that will see as rude. So what happened is I will go and knock on the door, talk about weather, ask them how they are, talk about their daughters. After about 20 minutes, I will say, by the way, your rubbish bin is sometimes a bit out. Can you please pull it back a little bit? So that's why they say Asians, they push a lot of bushes a little bit. So simply that is the reason, because they want to have that relationship first. And also the way that we communicate is very different. Especially non-verbal cues is the hardest one, because if you do not understand the culture, you cannot see it. That's why when when public sector working alongside communities, it's always good, they say, to have someone who understands the culture to guide you. That is the reason. It's because, your stuff, you're expert, and people know that. But it's how then you build that trust, and as well as knowing that non-verbal communication happen, because things that we do not know, we do not understand until someone actually are inside, then they can guide you through that process, and you'll find it way more effective. And I want to share with you two very interesting story, again, just to highlight the meaning behind certain things, especially when it comes to cultural nuances. When a Walkman was being invented, the Japanese owner who wanted the Walkman, as he's a frequent traveler and he liked classical music, and he wanted to be able to listen to music without disturbing the environment. Hence, Walkman was being invented through his request. But when they decided to introduce it to American, then actually had to flip the scripts. Instead of saying, I do not want to disturb the environment, they saying, I want to cut off the noise from the external world, because this is who I am. The same things being introduced, but how it became a culture phenomenon is through how individuals see themselves, where they stand in the world. And hence you might hear a lot of Asians say, I don't want to bother someone, or I don't want to bother the health system. It's because they don't want to disturb the environment. When I was working for Asian Family Services, when I asked them to get help, people's first reaction, especially Asian and also older people as well, their reaction is that there might be more people needed help than me. But the idea starts from they don't want to disturb the environment. And hence the conversations become, look, you're not burdening the system. You remember you pay tax, and that's the reason why the services is there for you and for you to access them. And then another example is when the roller coaster was being introduced to Japan, despite the company in America have a higher safety record, but incidents keep happening. And so the company keep sending people to Japan and look at why this happened. And they couldn't find any mechanical fall until they saw a picture. Because in America, when people are excited at the roller coaster, they put their hands out. So it's like, yeah! But in Japan, they get panic. So then they hold on to the metal and they bang their head into the. They both are excitement, but the interpretation of what excitement is also mean different things. So emotions, expressions might not necessarily mean the same things. You might saw news when Asians talking about tragic happening in their life, they kind of still have smile and laugh. It's not because they smile and laugh trivial the incident. It's because the culture had taught us, like we hold our emotions because we don't want to burden other people and make other people feel a burden that they need to carry on. And hence, they kind of have that face like laughing off and smiling. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, it hurts. So again, like assuming expressions of feelings, how it's being expressed, it doesn't necessarily mean the same things for the same culture. And so these are just an overview of some of the collective culture and individualist culture what that means, and in a continuum of scale between collective and individualistic culture. There are certain nuances because what I share is using some kind of like extreme example to show you the polarization of two culture, but we all live in that continuance based on setting and situation. And there's some changes as well that have become slightly different because of influence of Western society and media. The final point that I want to touch on is the 1.5 second generations of New Zealander that Sheldon talked about. The 1.5, let's say I'm migrant, so I'm the first generation from New Zealand. 1.5 would be children from age around 6 to 18 who moved to New Zealand, and also the second generation. Why it is important to highlight is this. For 1.5 second generation, they face a lot of challenges because their parents bring in their own reference and understanding of their own culture and instill into their children. But yet, the children, when they go out to New Zealand, receiving education in New Zealand, they're exposed to the individualistic way of methods of approaching questions and who they are. And so they're constantly facing this battle internally and conflict. Quite often it's not known by any of the adults. Example would be the kids might take lunch to the school and feel like they should finish the food because that is what been taught in at home, and then the school teacher might say, no, you don't have to finish it full, because that again exercise self-determination and autonomy. But when he get home, he might be told off by the parents because the parents say, why you didn't finish the food, because that again is respect and also value what have been given to you. And some kids able to navigate the two system and they don't feel anxious. But I talk to many 1.5 second generation young Asian New Zealander. They say sometimes they do not know who they are. If they too Asians, their Pagia friend might tease them. If they too Pagiha, when they go back to their groups, they would think they are not Asian enough. Some people have reflected that they are Chinese, but when they were in Chinese, and other Chinese will say, oh, you're not really Chinese. But then when they go to New Zealanders, they also don't see that they are being treated as part of the mainstream culture sometimes. And so there's two elements. One, the element is about like the space between the collective culture behavior that is still at home does not necessarily align with the individualistic culture that has been taught in school and the environment. And I also have people who told me every time when I walk into a situation, they need to ask themselves, do I need to be more Asian or Pakeha today? And which is a very sad thing, like when you have to constantly negotiate that space. And many of them actually say that they struggle with that identity and sometimes become an internalized racism of who they are as individual. And I have a lot more information on that. I run a podcast featuring different story, but if you're really interested, do look at like Wendy and Evangeline Brown, who has shared their experience as 1.5 second generations in New Zealand, how that have impacted their mental health, and also story about Wendy worked for the family in a takeaway and in the end become extremely burnout and the school have to intervene. From the law and from New Zealand society, that was considered as child labor, but from collective society, that is called taking responsibility and support your parents who needed help. So there's two very different conflicting views, and what that means is she had to dig very deep to find out who she is as an individual.